In this session on preventive cardiology, we're going to explore the role of various foods in the diet and how these foods can either become our friends or deadly foes. We'll also explore how the food industry often takes advantage of us by their labeling techniques. In this session, you'll learn how to find truth in labeling, but let's start by understanding the multiple factors which affect our blood cholesterol level. Only 25 to 30% of the cholesterol in our blood comes from dietary cholesterol. The vast majority comes from the liver. There are two major stimuli for the liver to produce cholesterol: dietary fats and sugars. Monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats stimulate the liver to make cholesterol, but not nearly as much as the saturated fats. This is why switching from saturated fats to polyunsaturated fats will help lower cholesterol levels. The other item stimulating the liver to produce cholesterol is dietary sugars. So to really lower cholesterol, the ideal cardiac diet is one that is high in fiber, low in cholesterol, low in total fat, low in saturated fat, and low in dietary sugars. The best foods to eat are beans, oats, vegetables, whole grain cereals, and fruits. Many people have heard that coffee causes high cholesterol levels and heart disease. The original research on coffee came from the FRAMINGHAM study. It was determined that people who drank more than 10 cups of coffee per day had 4 times as many heart attacks as people who did not drink coffee at all. More carefully designed studies were conducted later comparing people who didn't smoke or drink coffee to people who didn't smoke and drank a lot of coffee. As you might guess, when all the data was compiled, it was shown that smoking is what caused heart disease, not coffee. It is true, however, that people who drink a lot of coffee have higher cholesterol levels than those who don't. But studies also show that people who drink a lot of coffee also tend to eat a lot of donuts and cookies with their coffee. Hence, it's not always the coffee that's so bad as much as the company that coffee keeps. Saturated fats stimulate the liver to produce more cholesterol and triglycerides than do polyunsaturated fats. So it's very important to determine the difference between the two. The easiest way is to put the fat or oil into your refrigerator. If it turns hard, it's saturated and hard on your heart. If it stays liquid, then it's most likely polyunsaturated. Butter in the refrigerator turns very hard, more so than stick or tub margarine because butter contains more saturated fat. Liquid margarines have less saturated fats than tub margarine. Corn oil will stay liquid in the refrigerator because it has less saturated fat than any of the margarines. If you place a pork chop or a steak in the refrigerator, the fat around the meat becomes hard, so fats in meat are primarily saturated. Chocolate in the refrigerator turns very hard because chocolate contains large amounts of saturated fat. Many of the saturated fats in our diet are hidden. Most of the non-dairy creamers are made with highly saturated fats. You may have noticed the low-fat non-dairy creamers at the grocery store, but if you look closely at the label, you'll find the makers have simply substituted sugars for saturated fats. This isn't any better for your health since sugar stimulates the liver to make just as much cholesterol as does fat. The typical cheese snack crackers contain approximately 60 to 70% saturated fat. Coco Lopez, the base ingredient for pina coladas, is made from coconut oil, which is 85% saturated fats. So fats and sugars are hidden everywhere in the common diet. The ideal cardiac diet contains beans, oats, vegetables, whole grain cereals, and fruits. If you ask, what is the problem with that? The problem is that very few people like these things. Typically, the American diet is made up of large amounts of beef, pork, cheeses, ice cream, butter, eggs, and chocolate. Why should these items be limited? Let's look at the cholesterol content of some of these foods. The cholesterol in 3½ ounces of white fish, skinless chicken, lean veal, lean beef, and regular beef is very similar, a range between 66 and 99 milligrams. It's when you look at the saturated fats in these foods that the difference becomes apparent. Lean veal contains 15% fat. Sounds good, but it's roughly 35 times more saturated fat than in whitefish. Looking at regular hamburger, you'll see that it has 65 times more saturated fat than fish. Let's see how that translates. How much fish do you think you would have to eat to obtain the same amount of saturated fat in just one 3-ounce hamburger? There it is. You'd have to eat 13 pounds of fish. So now it's easy for you to see the real advantage of fish over hamburger, but there are even more hidden fats and cholesterols in the foods we eat, even in the foods we may think of as being good for us. Here are the cholesterol and saturated fat contents in pork sausage, cheddar cheese, organ meats, whole eggs, and ice cream. The saturated fat of pork sausage, even when the fat is drained, is 65 times higher than that of whitefish. Standard cheeses, such as cheddar, are extremely high in cholesterol and saturated fat. Just 1.5 ounces of cheddar cheese has 20.3 grams of saturated fat, more than 100 times the amount in fish. Even those cheeses labeled low-fat, such as mozzarella and provolone, in reality have a high amount of fat. They are only lower in fat when compared to standard cheddar cheese. The so-called low-fat mozzarella cheese actually contains 10.5 grams of saturated fat in a 3.5-ounce serving, which is more saturated fat than in lean beef and 50 times greater than the same serving of fish. If you eat only 3.5 ounces of cheddar cheese, you would have to eat over 21 pounds of fish to get the same amount of saturated fat. Fortunately, the recently developed fat-free cheeses are good sources of protein and truly low in fat. These fat-free cheeses should be substituted wherever possible for standard cheeses. Whole eggs are another source of high amounts of cholesterol and saturated fat. Fortunately, it's all contained in the yolk, which allows egg substitutes to easily replace eggs in standard recipes. Despite a recent study funded by the Egg Nutrition Council, egg yolks are so high in cholesterol and saturated fats that they should be referred to as death balls. A single egg yolk contains 220 to 250 milligrams of cholesterol. The egg white, however, is good for you. So whenever you have a recipe calling for eggs, it's best to substitute 2 egg whites for every whole egg in the recipe. There are different types of beef, and not all beef is bad for the cardiovascular system. Standard beef has large amounts of fat, even when visible fat is trimmed. For example, this T-bone steak has a lot of fat mixed in with the meat, so T-bone steak should be avoided. This steak, which is lean and mostly red, has very little fat. This type of beef is acceptable to eat in moderation and is relatively healthy to eat. Hamburgers can be good or bad depending on its fat content. Unfortunately, you cannot rely on labeling for the hamburger. Lean, extra lean, and super lean really don't have any standardized meaning. When you see the percent of fat on the label, it's listed by weight rather than percent of fat calories. So the best thing to do is to look at the hamburger. If you see lots of white specks, you know that there's a lot of fat in it. The hamburger on the left, however, has very little fat in it and is very lean. Even when it's lean, it's better to eat hamburger in moderation. The best hamburger to eat is that made from round steak, which has had the fat trimmed prior to grinding. Chicken without the skin has 1/10 the saturated fat of standard hamburger. But if you leave the skin on the chicken, it will have more saturated fat and total fat than lean hamburger. Ice cream is another source of saturated fats and sugars. There is some 6.6 grams of saturated fat and only 3.5 ounces of ice cream. And what is not saturated fats and cholesterol in ice cream is sugar, a substance we already know stimulates the liver to produce fats and cholesterol. For desserts, many people are substituting low-fat yogurt instead of ice cream. This is a step in the right direction, but there's a couple of things you need to know. The problem with standard low-fat yogurt is they contain high amounts of sugar. The recent light yogurts such as Dannon Light or Yoplait Light are actually low in sugar as well as being virtually fat-free. Approximately 50% of the calories in the artificially sweetened custard-type yogurts come from protein. Hence, these desserts are a vast improvement over ice cream and standard low-fat, naturally sweetened yogurt. Some frozen yogurt, however, even though it's labeled fat-free, sugar-free, cholesterol-free, and made with NutraSweet, actually does have high amounts of sugar. So what we have is the food industry defining sugar as anything that contains table sugar or sucrose. But remember, any form of sugar will stimulate the liver to produce fats and cholesterol. So be careful when something tastes very sweet and the food industry labels it as sugar-free, because in many instances it is not totally free of sugar. The typical American breakfast is a couple of fried eggs, bacon or sausage, and toast with butter. These foods are extremely high in cholesterol and saturated fat. This is a major reason for the heart disease being so common in our country. A typical American lunch is a milkshake, cheeseburger, and French fries, a meal once again high in fat, high in cholesterol, and high in sugar. Whenever you are served fried foods in a restaurant, you can almost certain that the saturated fats were used for frying. The point here is that lifestyle is much more consequential to our health than heredity. It's extremely important that you analyze your food choices from the information listed on labels. Then you can determine whether a particular food is good for your heart or not. So let's begin by understanding the basic substances in all foods. There are three basic substances in foods: proteins, carbohydrates, and fat. There are two types of carbohydrates: simple sugars, which usually taste sweet, and complex carbohydrates known as starches. Starches are made up of individual sugars linked end to end to end in large particles. They can actually be compared to a train. The individual sugar components of starch are like the boxcars. The only difference is that if a train were as large as a boxcar, the train would be 25 miles long. Starch particles are very, very large and made up of many, many sugar particles linked together. Remember we said earlier, starches do not stimulate your liver to make cholesterol and fat. Sugars, however, do. Carbohydrates are not the enemies in our diet. The enemy is sugar. A calorie is a simple measure of heat energy and is the amount of heat required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. If we burn 1 gram of protein, we would get 4 calories of heat. If we burned 1 gram of carbohydrate, we would obtain 3.4 calories of heat. If we burned 1 gram of fat, we would get 9 calories of heat. In essence, there is approximately 3 times as much energy in an ounce of fat compared to an ounce of protein and carbohydrates. An additional factor is that the body metabolizes fats much more efficiently than proteins and carbohydrates. Hence, the net food energy from eating proteins and carbohydrates is less than what would be obtained from the same number of calories from fats or sugars. There are several simple formulas to calculate the percent of fat calories. One is to take the grams of fat per serving from the label and multiply it by 3. This number will be put in the numerator of a fraction. The denominator or bottom number of the fraction will be the fat grams times 3 plus the protein grams plus the carbohydrate grams. The reason for the factor of 3 is that ounce for ounce, pound for pound, fat contains 3 times as much energy as does protein and carbohydrates. Another simple formula is to take the fat grams on the label and multiply by 10, then divide it by the total calories per serving from the label. The newest labels have the fat calories per serving and the total calories per serving. The percent fat calories is the fat calories divided by the total calories. All methods give similar numbers. So what is good heart food? Current recommendations from the National Cholesterol Education Program are that everybody in this country over age 2 obtain no more than 30% of total calories as fat. Saturated fat should be limited to 10% of total calories and polyunsaturated fats to 10%. Total cholesterol should be limited to less than 300 milligrams per day. This means cutting out fast food joints for the most part. Let's look at reasons why. Would Kentucky Fried Chicken be considered a healthy heart food? When you analyze the contents of Kentucky Fried Chicken, you will see that in 3.5 ounces there are 12.1 grams of fat, 30.5 grams of protein, and 1.8 grams of carbohydrates. The first thing you do is multiply the fat grams times 3. This is where the 36.3 comes from. Put this number at the top part of the fraction. In the bottom part of the fraction, you will have the fat grams times 3 plus the protein grams, 30.5, plus the carbohydrate grams, 1.8. Putting this together, we find this is 36.3 divided by 68.6, or 53%. 53% fat calories is much higher than the recommended percent fat calories of 30% in the basic cardiac diet. Furthermore, it's much higher than the 27% fat calorie restricted diet for patients with established heart disease or in those who have high cholesterol numbers. Does this mean you should never eat fried chicken? Sure, you can eat fried chicken. You're supposed to average 30% fat calories for the entire day. So if you know you're going to have a piece of fried chicken for lunch, you should have nothing but oatmeal for breakfast and nothing but beans and rice for dinner. In this way, the entire diet would average about 30% fat calories, and you would be okay for the entire day. How about turkey hot dogs? A lot of people think all turkey products are healthy. When you look at the amount of fat in a turkey hot dog, you see that there are 8.1 grams and 3.5 ounces. There are 5.8 grams of protein and 0.6 grams of carbohydrates. The first thing you do is to take the fat grams and multiply by 3. This is where the 24.3 comes from. This will be in the top part of the fraction. The bottom part of the fraction will be the fat grams times 3 plus the protein grams plus the carbohydrate grams. As you can see, 79% of the calories in a turkey hot dog come from fat. Not what you expected, is it? Many people are under the mistaken impression that all turkey products are healthy and all beef is bad. Now you understand why it's so important for you to analyze the fat content of various products. It's the only way to ascertain whether or not they're really safe to eat. Do you like Butterball smoked turkey sausage? It's advertised as 50% less fat. That's very interesting. 50% less than what? This product is still 75% fat calories. It's no different than turkey bologna. Kielbasa sausage is 84% fat calories. Chocolate, 60% fat calories, and almost all of it saturated. What's not saturated fat in chocolate is sugar. Turkey or chicken without the skin, roasted, is low in fat, 24 to 25%. Fish sticks, however, are very high in fat, even though they are fish and baked. The reason it's high in fat is because fish sticks are deep fat fried prior to being put in the frozen food section of the grocery store. Baked flounder, however, is extremely low in fat, only 9%. Baked fried crisp and drained still has 85% fat calories. Lean hamburger, however, when grilled, has only 28% fat calories. If a lean hamburger is put on a bun with lettuce, tomato, and fat-free cheese, total fat content would be as low as 20%. So a lean hamburger, if not gooped up with mayonnaise or other sources of fat, can be healthy. The biggest mistake the average person makes when attempting a low-fat, low-sugar diet is not eating adequate calories. A large bowl of oat bran for breakfast is low in fat, however it doesn't have many calories. Later at work, you'll find yourself hungry. Usually the only convenient things to eat at work are very high sugar, high-fat items known as candy and chips. If you eat these things, then you really didn't make any progress by eating oat bran for breakfast. So consider a large amount of oatmeal to start your day. Oatmeal contains enough calories to satisfy you until lunch. Then if you eat a chicken breast sandwich for lunch rather than a typical cheeseburger, the amount of fat that you eat will be much lower, and so will the calories. If, however, you don't make up the additional calories with beans, oats, or vegetables, you'll again find yourself extremely hungry 2 or 3 hours later. The key to success in obtaining a good heart diet is not so much on what you cut out, rather it's to increase your intake of good heart foods. Trying to reduce calories only makes you hungry and miserable. So instead, place your focus on the fact that for every good bite of healthy food that you take in, that is beans, oats, and vegetables, or whole grain cereals, you will eat less fats and sugars. So analyze the foods you eat all you want to eat, just make sure that what you eat is low in fat, low in cholesterol, low in sugar, and success will be yours.